Well, hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Two Geeks and a Marketing Podcast. As always, we're here to keep you up to date with the latest news, tech, content and wisdom from the world of marketing. And joining me, as always, all the way from France, is a man who's on a mission to demystify digital marketing. He's the host of the Content Marketing Studio video podcast. Please welcome Monsieur Pascal Fintoni.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Always a highlight to spend some time with the man who's also on the mission to keep marketing simple, the voice of the Marketing Firms podcast and the author of 𝗧𝗵𝗲 Marketing Plans. I give you Monsieur Roger Edwards.
Well, Pascal, here we are with episode 95. And as always, towards the end of the show, we have the film marketing section. And this week you've chosen a pretty long film. If I remember rightly, the film Waterworld clocks in about 3 hours, doesn't it?
That's if you are lucky enough to see the uncut director's version, but people went to the cinema to see a 2:15 version. The reason we chose this movie, not only was it published in 1995, so that's the link with today's episode, but for some reason, this movie has inherited such a bad reputation, and it's completely unfounded, and we're going to explore why.
I have to say, Pascal, I've been tainted with that reputation because I don't think that we've actually seen Waterworld since the original theatrical release, which means that we have seen that truncated 2-hour version that you were talking about. So really looking forward to talking about that. But as always, we've got a packed show, lots to get through in the news, etc., content spotlight. So I think we better start at the very beginning and dive straight into the news.
And we begin with Boots, who's launched its biggest ever healthcare campaign. Our health is as individual as we are, in support of women of all ages. The campaign combines TV, digital display advertising, print, social, in-store and online.
Morrisons is executing another round of price cuts in response to the cost of living crisis as the price war continues amongst UK supermarkets. Price reductions of almost a fifth on average will take place across a further 64 products, representing an additional investment of $25 million.
Costa Coffee has hired former marketer 𝗬𝗂𝗧𝗂𝗂𝗧 as its new CEO, who will start in April and succeed 𝗔𝗽𝗪𝗏, who left the business last summer to return to fast food chain McDonald's.
Yeah, Jill McDonald leaves to go back to McDonald's. There's something incestuous about that, isn't there? Amazon has decided it wants staff to work from the office the majority of the time, informing employees they are to do so at least 3 days a week from May the 1st.
Why to reduce avoidable food waste, the Co-op has removed best before dates from over 150 fresh fruits and vegetables products this week. The decision follows a trial on 20 products last year.
According to Impressions survey of 1,000 UK-based senior marketers, over two-thirds, 68%, of SMEs plan to increase their overall marketing budget in 2023, with more than half planning to invest more of that budget into brand awareness activity.
While data from media agency Spark Foundry suggests that 56% of consumers reported using social media to make a purchase in the 3 months to the end of December, up from 48%.
And finally, in the last year, interest in environmental issues has dropped by almost a fifth, well 19% actually, amongst UK's Gen Z, which has 16 to 25-year-olds, as the near constant cycle of negative news causes crisis fatigue. So Pascal, let's stick with that last piece of news there, this whole issue of crisis fatigue. Do you feel crisis fatigue? I think I do. Every time you look at the news, whether it's online newspapers, print newspapers, whether you're on a TV news program, it's all negative, isn't it? We've got obviously the horrifying war in Ukraine, but it's all one crisis after another. In fact, we use the word crisis so much more now that everything seems like a crisis. I mean, at the moment in the UK, we have got a tomato and pepper crisis because apparently there are no tomatoes and peppers left. That could be down to Brexit, or apparently it could be down to some storms in southern Spain, which have destroyed tomato and pepper crops this year. Do you feel crisis fatigue's real?
Yeah, and I think it's to do with the complete imbalance with regard to the media, whether it's online, whether it's in print and so on. And that's something that you and I can observe because we have the luxury of history. We can look back at 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and 30 years ago. And the way in which the news, so desperate, and I mean news, I use the term globally, Roger. I talk about anyone needs, to gather someone's attention. They're so desperate for that attention. They are so ill-equipped actually to even understand what people want to hear about, that they're going for shock, they're going for headline grabbing, they're going for clickbaiting, they turn to ChatGPT to do some 10 different versions of the same news article. And little by little, I talk to friends and family, and everybody is removing themselves from TV, from newspapers, and from social media.
Yeah, I think it's right, and quite a lot of the time, it's actually the language that is used, isn't it? The word crisis is so overused now. I remember back to the beginnings of the pandemic when the word unprecedented, everything was unprecedented, wasn't it? and crisis, and it just eventually these words worm their way into your head, and it does create that fatigue. And I think you're right. People are turning off. I mean, I've had that conversation with a number of people as well, as one of the only ways to feel mentally secure at the moment is to just not watch the news, because the news is guaranteed to get you feeling really pretty down about everything. So we really need to start looking for positive things out there.
Well, that's what we do on this show, Roger, of course.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at another item that we spoke about there. Again, it's slightly related. We've said to a certain extent some people are turning off social media, but according to this Spark Foundry, 56% of consumers are now using social media to guide purchases, which is up again from the previous year. Now, I remember years and years and years ago, and I'm going to get this wrong because I've only just thought of it and I haven't had a chance to look it up, but I remember Google coming out with something called, was it something like the 0 moment of truth?
That's correct, yeah.
When somebody, I want to buy a new car, I want to go on holiday, I want to buy a new washer, whatever it is, and you go to Google. And that's your 0 moment of truth when you start the purchasing decision. You do the Google search for the item you want to purchase. But now it appears that the 0 moment of truth has moved away from Google to a certain extent, and people are diving into TikTok, diving into Instagram stories or whatever it is, and starting the purchasing journey on social media.
Yeah, well, I think the data probably suggests that's where people spend most of their time, not discounting what we just mentioned about a desire to have access to positive news. I mean, when it comes to social media, people really, what they're saying is, I want to hear from my friends and family. I want to hear from my contacts. I want to smile. I want to be entertained. I want to kind of chuckle at someone's kind of, post and that kind of things. And then, so if, if you look at your time budget is spent on social media, then of course, advertisers and brands are going to be using that to their advantage. When the advert or the message is in tune with the platform, with the context, so they're using wit, they're using good timing and so on, and they avoid, that kind of crisis-led messaging, I suspect they're going to be very, very successful. I think what would be interesting is what happens next year. So looking at 2023 data, but yeah, I think that makes complete sense to me.
Moving back to one of the earlier items we discussed, Morrison's is introducing some more price cuts, and we've seen price cuts across UK supermarkets, and there is indeed in the UK a price war in the supermarket space at the moment. Now, it feels as if that's something that's passed me by because everything seems so expensive at the moment. But one thing that I have noticed, and I'd be interested to get the France perspective on this from you, Pascal, is that yes, some prices are coming down, but quite a lot of these manufacturers are playing this tricky game where they actually reduce the size of things as well. So you might be paying a smaller price, but they've also shrunk the packaging. So you're actually getting less for your money. And sometimes, and I've noticed this especially with things like Twixes or bags of crisps, is that the price stays the same, but the packaging actually gets smaller. And I've noticed particularly recently that some of the chocolate bars and some of the crisp packets that we used to have are now significantly smaller. I even joked with Tricia the other day that eventually we'll be buying individually wrapped crisps from some of these manufacturers. Is this happening in France as well? Are you getting price reductions? Are there price wars in the equivalent supermarkets in France? And do they do this packaging reduction thing as well?
So we don't have price reductions in France. And what is interesting is, because I listen to both the French news and the UK news, is there is a strange thing happening right now in the media whereby supermarket chains are being accused of not paying a fair price for what they're purchasing from the farming and agriculture sector and the food producers. So I think for us in France, the price was already on the high side. The one way we used to kind of satisfy ourselves with Denise, my wife, was that, well, if you do the exchange rate game in your head, that bag of crisps is not that expensive after all. But actually, it was more expensive than in the UK. So we don't have the price reduction. We are not yet getting the issue of shortage. And I think it's because, we are getting the supply from the rest of EU countries in particular. And more importantly, there's also a culture of buying at the market and buying from the local greengrocers as opposed to going to the supermarkets all of the time. So it's fascinating to observe as someone that's coming back to France after 32 years in the UK.
Yeah, I did read another article recently that did suggest that actually in the UK we've had it so good when it comes to food prices for the last couple of decades that we've got used to really, really cheap food, whether that's vegetables, whether it's meat, whatever it is, we've got used to really cheap food. And actually now, as a combination of Brexit and different structures and obviously weather events, we are now realizing that the time has come that food prices are going to increase. So maybe there's a lot of spotlights on this is a big Brexit event, this is a big problem, but maybe it is just an equalization of something that we have taken for granted.
It's so multifaceted. And it's not much fun, no matter whether you're unique in France and so on at this moment in time. And I think where the brands are going to win is actually when they present themselves in a way that feels very honest and ethical. And I'm in two minds about that news, about the co-op, what they're doing, the best before dates and so on. So can you actually engage the audience in a way that is honest, that is in tune with the current period of time, and be part of the chosen network of allies at this moment in time?
Yeah. Some fascinating news items there, Pascal. And I'm tempted to talk about Amazon wanting everybody to stay in the office now rather than working from home. And I do wonder, well, there's so many people who work for Amazon working in factories packing things up, so there's no way they can work from home. But we'll not go into that because we need to move on, because we've got some content spotlights to talk about. In the content spotlight section of the show, Pascal and I bring to the table a piece of content. It could be a video, it could be an article, it could be a podcast, and we go into it in quite a bit of detail. So Pascal, what have you got in your spotlight this week?
Oh, wow. Listen, I've got a video this week, and I'm very, very pleased because I've been working very hard to make it relevant to our audience as well. I mean, we always do, don't get me wrong, but I've chosen a video entitled The Art of the Opening Scene, How to Start a Movie 6 Different Ways. And this is by the team from 𝗔𝗍𝗵𝗵. Oh, by the way, to all our content spotlights and content creators out there, when you have a team effort, Roger and I are very, very keen to give credits where credit's due. So please, can you make sure that in the closing credits or in the descriptions, put your name, put the name of the team members. But for now, I will have to thank the founders of 𝗔𝗍𝗵𝗵, the kind of software solution to help you produce your movie. We're talking about Robert Karaz and Simona Klapan, who basically have been the driving force behind 𝗔𝗍𝗵𝗵. And this video talks and addressing the wants and needs of filmmakers and documentary makers, but I think there's definitely lessons in there, Roger, for anyone using video to market their business. So they're looking at 6 different ways in which a movie opens. And what they're suggesting is think about this as part of your visual storytelling. Think about this as part of how you're going to really bring an audience into your world. And I think that the techniques are relevant if you're doing case studies, if you're doing product demonstration, if you're doing a podcast interview, anything where you want people to engage swiftly and understand what this is about. So let's move on through the 6 techniques. Technique number 1, enter the villain. This is used a lot in movies whereby the only character that is introduced to begin with is essentially the villain. And they have the example here of The Dark Knight, reviewed, by the way, all of you on Two Geeks and Marketing podcast. And this is the introduction of the Joker and Heath Ledger when they are robbing the bank. And so if you take it into the world of business, this is you introducing the problem. This is you introducing the obstacle. This is you introducing essentially what is causing your clients to need you and to demonstrate and display essentially the impact of that, challenge that you can be the problem of. So technique number 1, enter the villain. So of course, technique number 2 is going to be enter the hero. And the example they're showing here is Skyfall, because we are not just introduced to James Bond. Skyfall reviewed on Two Geeks and Marketing podcast as well. They introduced James Bond, but we are treated to a 10-minute chase sequence across Istanbul. The other one that they actually mention is Vertigo. So same, we have our anti-hero chasing actually somebody across rooftops and nearly falling to his death. So I never realized there was a correlation between Skyfall and Vertigo until today. So then what you can do is combine the two. Technique number 3, establishing relationships. So can you, maybe in a montage scenario, create interaction between the villain and the hero swiftly, so you can build the tension, and then of course the story revealing how the hero can of course overcome the villain, or in your case how you have helped your client overcome the obstacle. So they're showing a couple of examples there, but the one that they mentioned was Mad Max Fury Road. So the opening scene is the character looking to the distance that suddenly jumps into his incredible vehicle and kind of racing across the desert, only to be caught by the baddies. And the other one, which I thought was interesting in terms of showing the different characters in a montage situation, was Reservoir Dogs. If you recall, they're all in a cafe having this kind of exchange. So you could do the same thing here. And this could be actually a team video. So before you show the full story of the team, you could have a montage of snippets and vox pops of the different team members, and then you reveal more about it. Technique number 4, what they call the plot catalyst. So this is all linked to the villain and, of course, the journey to overcome the villain. So why is this happening? What is maybe the event or the object or the crisis, to use that term again, that is creating the need for that story to be told? 2 examples they mentioned, Lord of the Rings. So we opened, if you recall, with the flashbacks, talking about the rings of power. So that's the catalyst. Mission Impossible 3. Do you remember the rabbit foot?
Yeah.
This is how we open. We watched it recently. And then one of my I love all movies, as people will know, The Children of Man. Have you seen that one, Roger?
Oh, not for a long time.
Yeah. It opens with our anti-hero stepping outside of a cafe yet again to be faced with an explosion and conflict and so on. And it becomes a catalyst. So where on one hand, with technique number 1, you kind of show the villain, if you like, the obstacle. In technique number 4, you're really going to demonstrating, the why it's happening and so on. It's a lovely one to do. Technique 5 and 6 are interesting from the context of moving from filmmaking to video marketing. So technique number 5, they call this follow the genre. So what they're saying is, begin your story, begin your video, begin your case study, your promo reel with a style of music and title sequence that pay an homage to a genre. It could be Western, it could be sci-fi, it could be comedy, whatever. And then you bring people into that one, and you can continue to make a nod to that style you've chosen as part of the execution and almost the tone of voice of the video. So yeah, why not? You could begin a product tour as almost a Western style with a standoff between maybe your staff and the item or the software solution, whatever, and then you can go into that. And then finally, number 6 is what they call flip the genre. So start with a well-established genre and then flip it to surprise the audience. So the example I can think of, we've seen in movies before, somebody goes home late at night, you've got the music, you've got the darkness of the night, you've got lights and so on, and it feels as though this character is in danger. They open the front door, they step inside, surprise, and there's a birthday party, for them. So you flip the genre, and then you carry on the story being told about that. And the one example that was mentioned about keeping you on your toes all of the time is the horror comedy Get Out.
Yeah.
So there you have it. This is the art of the opening scene, how to start a movie or a visual story in 6 different ways, thanks to the team at Studio Binder.
Wow, it's so good. I mean, when you were explaining those 6 things, of course, my brain was trying to immediately go to... I'm glad you gave me examples, because I was probably sitting there thinking, oh, what film would fit that? But fortunately, you did fill in the blanks. I mean, I love it again. It comes back to how many times storytelling is featured on Two Geeks and a Marketing podcast, and how important it is for businesses and marketing to be able to tell a good story, and how often we can take techniques from the movies and use them in our marketing. It's so good to see something, to watch something like this that gives us all of those ideas. Now, this is a story about a marketing failure.
Okay.
And I sort of came across this video by accident. It's a video on YouTube by a guy called Tom Scott. Have you come across this guy?
No, I haven't. No, thank you.
Now, this guy has got nearly 6 million subscribers on YouTube, which is a phenomenal amount of people. He's actually also got a second channel called Tom Scott Plus, which has just got shy of 1 million. So he's fairly influential on YouTube, and he's not a vlogger. It's actually a lot of his videos come across as actual TV programs, and each one of them will have been researched very, very well. And one day he could be looking at how a radio telescope works. Another day he could be looking at a microwave oven. Another day he was actually on he's terrified of roller coasters, and they got him along to Alton Towers and made him go on Nemesis to conquer his fear of roller coasters. But the one that caught my attention has the title, Why You Can't Buy Dasani Water in Britain. And the subheading to the video was one of the greatest marketing disasters of all time. And this is an absolutely fascinating video, and it's only about 5-6 minutes long. But it's such a good story. Now, Dasani is a water brand marketed predominantly in the United States by Coca-Cola.
Okay.
Now, unlike Perrier or some of the sparkling mineral waters that you and I would recognize from the supermarket shelves in the UK and probably France as well, in America, it's okay for companies to sell effectively purified tap water. And Dasani is purified tap water. In the UK, if you sell mineral water on the supermarket shelf, it has to actually be mineral water. You have to be able to prove that it bubbles up somewhere from a mountain spring or something like that, and it's got to have a certain number of minerals in it, etc. But in America, they can basically fill a bottle of water from the tap, stick a label on it, and sell it, and that's actually accepted. Now, interestingly enough, they decided to try and launch this Dasani stuff in the United Kingdom. And the great thing about what Tom does is he sort of gives a bit of background. There was also a UK sitcom, possibly one of the most famous UK sitcoms of all time, Only Fools and Horses, about 5 or 6 years.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
about 5 or 6 years before Dasani was launched in the UK, there was an episode of Only Fools and Horses where basically Del Boy and Rodney clocked this idea of filling up bottles with tap water, sticking a label on it and selling it as mineral water. And the whole episode is built around this. And in the end, it actually turned out that it was contaminated water with radiation, and the water was glowing and everything. It was very, 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 very funny episode. But this program obviously was shown on Christmas Day. Millions of people watched it. And this whole idea, the psyche of Del Boy and Rodney filling up bottles of water in their kitchen and flogging them on supermarket shelves was there as a sort of resting memory in the minds of the UK population. Along comes Coca-Cola and launches Dasani into the UK, and initially, Pascal, it was actually quite successful. But then a journalist, just one journalist, did a little bit of research and found out that unlike Perrier, which is genuinely mineral water, Dasani is effectively purified tap water. And he published an article which then got picked up on the news wires. And then somebody made that connection between Dasani being tap water, Del and Rodney in that TV episode, and all of a sudden the whole thing comes crashing down, and by a staggeringly, probably unfortunate coincidence, the bottling factory for Dasani was actually only about 5 miles away from Peckham.
Come on,
where seriously, where Only Fools and Horses is actually set. And just around about this time as well, that factory was unfortunately delivered a poor batch of one of the purification chemicals, and they had to do a recall of hundreds and thousands of bottles of Dasani. And then again, everybody's mind goes to Del and Rodney, the radiation, the glowing water. And basically after that, Coca-Cola just said, you know what, sod it, we're not doing it, and off they went. And Dasani has disappeared from supermarket shelves, and apparently it's not available. They never carried on the launch beyond the UK. It's not available in Europe. Still available in the US, because the US don't mind purified tap water. And I think if you do a bit of digging, there are certain places in the US where even the tap water, smells sulfury or just smells horrible. So purified tap water is an established thing. So Tom Scott, totally and utterly random, but a fabulous bit of storytelling. And I'm going to give him one more plaudit as well, because he did this episode in what I think is one take. And he was starting, and it looks like he's walking down basically at the side of an A road, fairly busy A road, and he times it perfectly. So when he gets to the description of the factory being 5 miles away from Peckham, he then just sort of turns to the side and points, and there he is walking past this factory. But I think, and you can watch the video later and let me know, I think he did it in one take, and he didn't fluff his lines once. And just after he'd finished, a great big lorry went past, and that would have ruined the shot earlier if it had happened. So kudos, great piece of filmmaking and a fabulous marketing story.
That's absolutely brilliant. I was trying to rack my brain actually, because I think it was called Peckham Spring or something.
It was Peckham Spring, yes, that's right. Yeah.
But no, so let's go back to video production. This is so hard to do because, as people will see from the many outtakes we produced, I am a line fluffer, so there's no way I could pull this off. And I know that I can imagine the scene, but I'm looking forward to seeing that. But here's the example of what we mean about visual storytelling and video marketing. In all of your viewers and listeners in your industry, there will be stories, good, bad, and ugly. There will be things you can look back in time and look ahead and so on. And for you to give your commentary, to kind of give your take on it. So does that mean that if somebody out there owns, I would imagine, an empty bottle of Dasani, that could be quite a bit of money on the if you want to put it online.
Absolutely, and in fact, he does have a bottle of Dasani.
Does he?
The video, and it's actually whether he's filled it up with other tap water, I don't know, but it did have water in the bottle, which is quite interesting. Really fascinating.
Thank you so much, Roger. Brilliant selection.
That's a great bit of fun. Okay, so Pascal, let's move on to what I know is one of your favourite parts of the show, and that is marketing, tech, and apps. Well, in this part of the show, Pascal and I bring to the table apps that make our marketing lives easier and more successful. So, Pascal, what delights have you got for us this week?
Yeah, kindly, you mentioned this is one of my favorite segments because this is just, I'm absolutely amazed that 3 years later of producing Two Geeks and Marketing podcast, I can still get excited and found new apps and solutions. I mean, by the time we reach episode number 100, Roger, where I reviewed more than 400 options for our listeners and viewers. So it's just amazing. This is actually, once again, inspired by recent conversation with customers. We're finding there's a slight change in kind of I could put it, mood with regard to interacting with prospects and leads. So the request for proposals, yeah. So by the time you have an exchange, whether it's face-to-face, Zoom, or email, eventually somebody asks you for a proposal. And it is clear to me that there is a departure away from the Word document type proposal. See what I mean? Full of words, full of sections and chapters and so on. And it looks as though more and more people are more than happy, if not happier, with a visual statement. Something where there's less to read, more to look at, more to be inspired about, and so on. So I've been doing some research on how to create those visual stories. You could argue more static in nature. And I've been doing a lot of research on pitch decks and the structure, the the visual stimuli, the way in which they use icons and photography, big fonts, and so on. You could almost argue, Roger, it's like a storyboard for a future video. So what I've done is I've come across this platform called Pitch Deck Hunt. And it's a bit like Product Hunt in nature, which is this is a collection of over 1,000 pitch decks across industries. So you have a menu on the left-hand side where you can select your industry and different categories. What I loved about it as well is that it's focused on startups and it goes back into history, which includes, for example, the original or one of the original pitch deck of YouTube. 2005 pitch deck for YouTube. And it looks awful, by the way, because
I'm sure it does.
20 years later, we've changed our stance. But it's fascinating to see what people thought, the information they were sharing, and so on and so forth. And of course, you can find more recent one. So once you've been inspired by the selection on Pitch Deck Hunt, you need to create your own. Yes, you can go on Canva, you can use PowerPoint, you can use many of the platforms that Roger and I have shared with you, but there's one called, and I'm sure they are so pleased with the purchase of their domain name, pitch.com. So pitch.com it's almost like an online workspace. It's not as advanced as Canva, and maybe that's for the better. You're going to move much, much faster, but essentially it's there to create pitch decks, project plan, conference keynotes, and proposal. And it takes you through a bit of a questionnaire. It starts to populate some of the slides, and then you can take over and add more of your information. And it feels as though you should at least have both options. Have maybe an offer to your prospects, the short visual story, and the longer, more elaborate, kind of written form in a Word document or PDF.
This is really interesting because I have seen on LinkedIn particularly quite a few people criticizing pitch decks that companies use to do kickstarts or just do venture capitalist fundraising, and that you almost get penalized if you turn up and your pitch deck isn't pitch perfect. Intended, and almost to the point where it becomes more of a sort of death by PowerPoint rather than a genuine business proposal. So this is really quite interesting because it focuses you back to the point of view that you've actually got a story to tell, you've got some facts to put across, and it isn't about the number of slides. It might even not be about any slides. It's about the story and it's about the structure. So that's really interesting. This week, Pascal, I've been having a look at video editors. I think I've mentioned this before. My Adobe suite renewal is coming up. And at the moment, I've got a really good deal on my Adobe suite. I basically have access to all the Adobe products for a relatively decent amount. And because every year when I come to renew it, they try to put the price back up and I threaten to cancel. Unfortunately, they've kept it low. I've been suspecting that this year I'll just have to start paying the full whack, and that will mean that I will probably drop to a lower package and probably just keep Adobe Premiere Pro, which is the video editor that I use more predominantly, and I'll start using Audacity as opposed to Adobe Audition for audio editing. But it did get me looking at alternatives to Adobe Premiere Pro, more particularly free options. Now, I actually came across a couple of articles and a couple of videos that ranked the top 5 free video editors. Now, I could have done the top 5, but I thought in the spirit of marketing tech and apps, we do try to limit it to 2. So the top 2 free video editors out there are as follows. The first one is called Kdenlive, KDEN Live, Kdenlive. Now, I remember a few years ago, when I was moving on from Camtasia, which I used to use for my vlogs, I remember having a look at Kdenlive and thinking it was horrible, clunky, very slow, and I just couldn't manage it at all. And that effectively prompted me to start using Adobe Premiere Pro. But now, having looked at obviously many iterations later, Kdenlive is a really powerful program, and the fact that it's absolutely free is really quite remarkable. And it, as you would expect, it's developed and it has quite a lot of the features and the functionality that Adobe Premiere Pro has. Now, obviously, it doesn't have everything. It can't do everything. But let's face it, I don't use everything on Premiere Pro. I mean, film studios use Premiere Pro for video editing these days. And the second one is one that probably everybody will have heard of. It's called DaVinci Resolve. And again, the fact that it's free and the fact that it has so much functionality and it mirrors quite a lot of what Premiere Pro does is actually quite remarkable. Now, one of the criteria for the article that I was reading was that these have to handle 4K video. Now, I do remember in the past that Kdenlive and DaVinci Resolve's free versions actually limited you to 1080p, and that was potentially a problem for somebody who wants to edit in 4K. But now it would appear that these free versions allow you to edit up to 4K, which again, for a free piece of software, is absolutely remarkable. So if you're wanting a sort of Premiere Pro-esque level of video editing capability, but you don't want to pay the fee, Kdenlive or DaVinci Resolve are definitely worth a look.
Thank you very much. Do you know, I don't think I know about Kdenlive for all, it's back to what I was saying. There's always something new you can discover, but also you're reminding us, go back. You and I have done this before with other kind of software reviews, but also ask yourself the question, I may be loyal to DaVinci Resolve and be loyal to Premiere Pro, but actually, is there something better, cheaper, faster? Yeah. Because you should be loyal to the story and to the audience, not to the platform. It is for them to actually work harder to make little. And I'm always amazed about how poor platforms are communicating what they're doing, the changes, and how we can, sometimes, well, particularly social media, we keep stumbling upon it as opposed to being informed about it.
Exactly.
So I'll have a go at that. Thank you very much.
Great stuff. So, Pascal, it's time for us to go back in time. So we need to fire up the flux capacitor, set the controls of the TARDIS, and we are going back to this week in history.
And in 1966, the BBC announces that Britain will be the first country in Europe to offer regular TV programming in colour. Responsible for overseeing the new colour service was the then controller of BBC Two, David Attenborough.
In 1970, telephone services opened to the public for calls between the US and Britain. The collaboration between AT&T and the British Post Office was made possible thanks to Intelsat 3 satellites in orbit over the Atlantic.
And in 1974, Atari introduces Grand Track 10. It is the first arcade driving video game to use solid-state read-only memory, ROM, to store sprites of its cars, the game timer, the racetrack, and the score.
And in 1985, the Internet's domain name system, DNS, was created, and the first domain to be registered was symbolics.com. So, Pascal, tell me a bit more about the telephone service and the collaboration between AT&T and the GPO.
It just shows what is possible. Can I just say, people, 1970, it was a long time ago. And I'm just amazed at what was possible then. Because, we always have this feeling that the last 10 years is when it all happened. And, we have access to mobile phones and 5G and so on. So you have this incredible collaboration between, I suppose, government and private sector to launch 5 satellites into space to orbit there. So we're going to say, well, why 5? Well, because here's the thing, Roger. If you want to have a service that is always on, you can't just for the satellite to do its round around the Earth to be in the right position at all time. So they launched 5 satellites. They all had different kind of cycles around the Earth, so that at all times you had at least 2 that were over the Atlantic that could handle the phone calls. And what we're talking about here is someone in America ringing, sending essentially microwave into space to then them to be bounced down to the UK for someone to pick up the phone with very little delay, and it has continued ever since. Now we do have obviously subsea cables, which we discussed oddly on this week in history in print, but I'm just want to pause for a moment and just agree that it is pretty amazing that in 1970, 25 years after the Second World War, where the world was still busy rebuilding itself, that people were able to collaborate and make this happen. And I think that was a precursor of all the form of communication that we have today, and the planning and the engineering and so on. And I want to take it back to then the 1966 news about the BBC being the first color programmer in Europe, and the way in which Britain was first on so many different things. And I have an anchoring for that time again, that period of time again, because I think somehow it's gone elsewhere. Would you agree?
Oh, yeah.
So I just want to spend a moment to just applaud the engineers and people that worked on that. Just incredible.
It is sobering, isn't it? It is sobering. And again, I'm going to talk about Atari launching Grand Track 10. And as you said, it's the first arcade driving video game to use sprites and to create that immersive environment. And the thing that's amazing me is that was 1974. Now, I always feel that I was there when video games really took off. I was on St. Anne's Pier pretty much every day after school with a pocket full of 10p pieces and playing games like Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and eventually Defender, which was my absolute ultimate favourite video game. And in my head, that was the early 80s. That was 81, 82. But here we are saying that Atari did this Grand Track 10. And I'm sure there was a Grand Track 10 unit on St. Anne's Pier. And that was 1974. That's amazing. That was a lot earlier than I thought.
I would agree. Can I just say I was rubbish at this game? It was hard. It was very hard to play because not only did you have to control the car, but you had to know a bit about car driving because you had the brake and the speed up. You had also it wasn't gear as such, but it was can you go faster and lower? And it was a very difficult track to maneuver around. And I was always in awe of boys and girls older than me that could get the car to skid around the corner because also there was an issue around time and high scores and so on. But Atari did that, and then they did the home entertainment unit as well. I remember friends of ours had it, and we could play a version of Pong or tennis, on the TV screen. So always ahead of the game, and again. I'm very nostalgic today for some reason. I just wish that there was still a strong player in today's video game industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think they do still exist, don't they? Because I have played games recently where I know that Atari have at least been the publisher, but they definitely don't seem to be at the cutting edge as they were all those years ago. Wow. As always, This Week in History gives you that moment where you do need to sit and think, as you said, the debt that we owe to these pioneers from the past that give us the life that we have today. I mean, imagine the thought of not being able to make a phone call now. I mean, my sister in Los Angeles, I can pick up my mobile phone and phone her, and there she is. Whereas in 1970, before that satellite came along, you couldn't do that. I mean, it just beggars belief, doesn't it? So, Pascal, let's bring things right back up to date now. It's time to do some creator shout-outs. Okay, Pascal, who are you giving a shout-out for this week?
Okay, so this is about the work of 𝗧𝗵𝗲 𝗡𝗵𝗃, an IT business analyst, a digital content creator, and the MSP community manager for 𝗬𝗏.co.uk, the hub for MSP. And he's the author of an amazing article. And I want to kind of spend some time because it's also an example to follow, but also one that's all about what content marketing is about. The article is How to Address Quiet Quitting to Engage Staff in Your IT Business. But I think this article will be relevant to any time or any type of business, and any sector. The reason why I chose it is because the timing is impeccable. This is exactly what content marketing is about. You study, you analyze, wants and needs. You look at obviously behavior on search engine and social. You adopt a theme. This one was around quiet quitting and the Great Resignation, which we mentioned, if you recall, in the news last year. And then you literally share your findings. And this is about not necessarily being the expert. This is about taking the trouble to save time for your audience by doing your research. And then you structure your article accordingly. So you have, of course, the section of what is quiet quitting. Then you move on to, is quiet quitting still a problem today? The dangers of disengaged employees, steps you can take to mitigate the problem, what happens when you can't reach a compromise, the legacy of quiet quitting, conclusion, and the sources mentioned in this article. And this is not just an article full of words. You have graphics, you've got also sources, you've got data, you've got so many things going. So not only I think it's a great resource for anyone in business as a team leader and so on. But for me, the reason I chose it, Roger, is this is what we mean by content marketing, or the pre kind of creation phase, the creation phase, and you go back and you add value to your article. And I think for me, I just found that it was important to bring it to the fore at a time where, sadly, we're going to see more and more mundane, monotone kind of content, in particular, if you're using some of those infamous AI platforms.
Absolutely right. Let's not talk about the infamous ChatGPT. Oh my goodness. So Pascal, my shout out this week was almost my content spotlight. I'm shouting out another YouTube channel, doing a bit of a theme on YouTube channels at the moment. This YouTube channel is called Nerdwriter, and this guy tends to look at scripts for films and scripts for TV shows, amongst other things. And the reason it wasn't a content spotlight is because we've already talked about the subject of the film Passengers. We've done that in film marketing. One of my favorite science fiction films, Passengers, starring Chris Pratt, and her name's gone completely out of my head, but you know who I mean. And this guy actually just creates this video to say, what would happen if we actually just rearrange the plot of Passengers slightly?
Oh, okay.
And he does an absolutely remarkable job. Now, very, very quickly, the plot of Passengers is Chris Pratt's character wakes up on a spaceship far too early. He should have slept for another 90 years. He wakes up and he spends a year trying to put himself back to sleep, trying to create a life on his own on this spaceship while hundreds and hundreds of other people are sleeping. And in the end, he wakes up another of the passengers, and for a moment they're all happy and they eventually fall in love. But then she finds out that he actually woke her up, and that causes all sorts of trouble. And in the end, the spaceship is endangered, and they collaborate together to fix the spaceship, and they all live happily ever after. What he does here, and I'd love to see a cut of this film work like this, he actually starts the film, and this actually ties beautifully back to your content spotlight earlier, where you were talking about how films start. He suggests that films should actually start when she gets woken up, and she's actually the point of view character. So she gets woken up, then she finds him and hears his story about how he has been awake for a year. She assumes that it's a similar mistake that woke her up, and then they go through the usual, they fall in love, etc. Then she finds out, and she's absolutely livid, as in the main film. They then have to collaborate on fixing the problem, stopping the ship from exploding. But actually, in his version, Chris Pratt then dies, and she's left on her own on the ship. And the ending of the film is her looking down at another person in a sleep pod.
Nice.
And it's the will she or won't she wake somebody up just like he woke her up. And I thought, do you know what? That would work, wouldn't it? So Nerd Writer, fantastic. I want to see The Passengers rearranged director's cut in cinemas near me sometime soon.
That's brilliant. And you know what? That is also an incredible segue to film marketing, because this is what fans did about Waterworld.
Yeah. So let's move on to probably our favourite part of the show. Let's be honest, Pascal. Let's move on to film marketing. Well, Pascal, this week we are going to talk about Waterworld. This is your film choice. And before we dive into an analysis of the film itself and the marketing campaigns that surround it, let's have a look at the trailer.
The sun. For millions of years, the source of life. But for one planet, the source of its demise. The temperatures climbed. The vast fields of ice at its poles melted, and the oceans rose. Centuries later, few people remain on this planet once called Earth. Among them, a man who still searches, a woman who still hopes, and a small child who carries the secret to a new beginning. In this place they know only as Waterworld.
Well, they don't make trailers like this anymore. I think we should go back to the days of The Voice. I mean, that guy, it's been part of our life, it would seem, for a very long time. You knew that you would be well looked after by The Voice or those trailers. Waterworld, 1995, barely 2 years after, you could say, the birth of the internet in a public domain kind of way. And the most misunderstood film, in my view, somehow tarred with this reputation being a flop, where in fact it's been financially a success globally over time, I grant you. One that to this day is reviewed by the fans galore, has had the DVD, the Blu-rays, the 4K releases, and talking about even a TV series. It's just an interesting one for us to explore. But yeah, I went to the movies in 95, like many people, and watched it. And I absolutely loved the universe, the world setting. I loved, obviously, the mariner played by Kevin Costner, and this catamaran, this kind of, his little, literally it was like a little bubble on this ocean. I mean, if you are one of the 10 people who've not seen Waterworld, this takes place in the future. The ice cap has melted completely, and the world is entirely made of water. And a small band of survivors are looking for land, and a young girl, Enola, has a map tattooed on her back that could take people to the promised land, and so it goes on. Yeah, Waterworld. What did you make of it?
Well, Pascal, I don't think that I've seen this film since we went to the cinema to see it after its original release. So my memories of it are very, very vague. I remember at the time thinking maybe that it was Mad Max on boats instead of Mad Max in cars. I had that image in my head that Kevin Costner was playing a very, very similar character to Mad Max, perhaps not as mad, but the vibe was there. Dennis Hopper was that sort of he's always a manic villain, isn't he? Dennis Hopper. What am I saying? But you know what I like. So I do remember being amazed by how on earth must they have done this? They've spent all that time in the water. But I don't genuinely have either positive or negative thoughts about it. It's just a film I saw, probably enjoyed at the time, but it's not one that I've sought out on Blu-ray or DVD. I don't own a copy of it on Blu-ray or VHS or whatever. It's just one of those films. And I don't know whether I've become a victim of the negativity that surrounds this film and that I need to, and I probably will review it now having had this conversation. But yeah, it was a good film, but it's just not one that's stuck in my mind. And like a film like Lord of the Rings would, or Die Hard, that I constantly go back to. This is one that I just haven't gone back to, and I don't know why.
And that's why I want to really explore, because, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, which is almost very, very unfair. So going back in time, literally, this movie was released in the summer in the US and the UK in 1995. Then there was a very sluggish rollout across the rest of the world, to the point where it was in the autumn when it was released in France. And that's tricky, because this was really a desire by, I'm going to say Universal, I could be completely wrong. It is Universal. It was back to this idea of the summer blockbuster. This is meant to be the summer blockbuster. But you have an issue, because actually, once you do the research, and as I discovered, because I have a copy of the full version, which is around 3 hours long, we went to the movies to see a version that was 2 hours and 15. 45 minutes is a hell of a lot of slicing and dicing and hacking away, which means that what they had to strip out was the storyline and the bonding between the mariner, Kevin Costner, and the young girl, because at the beginning and more around the world and the survival, and actually they spend a bit longer on the island. So maybe already we have a compromised product, to use a term when you go to the movies. But this movie inherited this unfair reputation, and I do say unfair because if you look at the financials, it was fine. I mean, they made their money and more. It was so good that people did a novel. There was video game. There was even an official pinball machine. There's in all the major Universal parks, Hollywood, Singapore, in Japan, and Beijing, they have a Waterworld zone where there's stunts and the storylines being retold and so on. So they're not particularly embarrassed about it. They're even talking about doing a TV series with the director of Prey. So for me, this movie began but being condemned by the critics whilst in production, because of what people took exception to the runaway cost and budget. So they were saying, hang on a minute, this is costing far too much money. And my reaction is, well, whose money is it? Why would you have such a strong view? And as you read and learn, particularly from interviews from Kevin Costner and the others, they were besieged by problems, bad weather, damaged sets. They had to rebuild them again. There was obviously people falling ill, and so on and so forth. And his view was, he always said to Universal Pictures, this is a $120 million movie, 140. They said, well, we'll give you half. So as a entrepreneur, he took half and then got what he wanted in the end. And then, of course, they had to add more for delays, repairs, and so on. Because of that, they also spent money on marketing, which you and I would approve. But that caused critics to be even more offended for some reason about how dare you spend your own money on marketing. But, when you have ambition like they had to create this world and natural elements working against you, you've got to spend the money. But that was just the most bizarre. And experts suggest that was the beginning of some of the poor use of the internet, because, of course, critics who had little to say and do about the movie because of the secrecy, they went on to criticize, the production cost.
Why did they launch such a truncated version, Pascal? Did you discover the reason for that? Was that a decision by the studio that it was just too long and we want you to edit it down? There
was two things. They lost their nerves.
Yes.
They believed that they could get more bombs on seats, not wishing to be crude about the expression, but in one day, how many sittings can you get? It's a bit like, using the aircraft analogy, how many seats can you have on the Boeing 747? And they really lost their nerves because of the mounting kind of negative feelings about it. And I'm going to add a layer of that. I think in general, the industry just had something with Kevin Costner. They just didn't seem to really warm to the guy. But this is a man that gave us Dances with Wolves, JFK, Robin Hood, and I don't know, there was something going on and they had to react accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, do you think it was anything to do with the competition from other films? I mean, there was certainly a lot of fairly sizable hits coming out in 1995, Toy Story, Stargate, Braveheart, Bridges Over Madison County, The Usual Suspects, Seven, Heat, 12 Monkeys, Goldeneye. It was a bumper year for... I mean, look how many of those we've actually reviewed on the show. I mean, it's... maybe they just decided we need to try and make this more pacey. We need to cut it down to fit it in, as you say.
I mean, sorry, I'm suddenly being thrown back in time to 95. That was a good year to be a movie fan. My goodness, I'd forgotten about all that. Yeah. So I think for me, maybe as well with hindsight, so the desire to literally blow people's minds and surprise them, and they didn't want to reveal about the world of Waterworld. They wanted to shock you. They didn't even want to reveal, for example, talking about the opening scene. So the opening scene is really quite famous nowadays because it's about the Universal logo around the globe. And then slowly but surely, as the camera is swooping in, the ice cap is melting, which you can see. And little by little, the whole world becomes blue. And then you crossfade to, the real world. This was 1995, Roger. This was like quite a coup in terms of technology. But they thought, no, let's not show that to people. We want that to be revealed at the movie. So I think the secrecy also fueled this strange attack on the film by critics, because once people went to see the movie, they loved it, of course.
Yeah. No, it is bizarre. So what did they do with the marketing then, given the fact that they seem to be stacking the deck against themselves?
Well, quite a bit. So they began by releasing, obviously, quite striking posters. The one that we know universally is that picture of Kevin Costner standing out there, dressed, I would agree, that kind of Mad Max-esque outfit with a kind of harpoon gun, the term Waterworld, and at his feet, you've got essentially the only kind of bit of oasis in this world, and Kevin Costner. And the other one that was done, but I think was more for the US market, was more of a two-column design. On one hand, you've got the water with what we learned to be then the symbol of how to get to the promised land, and then a close-up of Kevin Costner's face, and you do that. And I think with hindsight, they could have done more with all the other characters. Again, time constraints, briefs, we don't know what it is. And then very quickly they released a teaser trailer. Well, that was quite enigmatic on purpose. They were showing the world, the characters, and so on. There was not the narration that we heard a moment ago from The Voice. And really people could see that this is actually a action-packed, entertaining movie for the family. I think that was also there for the family market. And then you had, obviously, later on the official trailer that we watched and heard. So what did they do to kind of counter this kind of strange attack? Then they invested, which is where the budget went in quite a significant number of TV spots and radio spots. So thanks to the wonderful people on YouTube who are kind of the librarians and archivists of the internet, I managed to discover about 15 different TV spots, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 60 second extended TV spots of 2 minutes. And what was interesting, I'm going to take you back to the content spotlights. All the TV spots had a different opening scene. So going back to the characters, sometime we heard the voice of Deacon, played by Dennis Hopper. Sometime it was Jim Tripplehorn. Sometime it was different characters. So whilst in general they all said the same thing, the way they started was always different. I thought was actually, what you would expect, but we're going back to 95, of course. And that's really quite fun to see. So you've got all of that going on, but I think they had to go beyond, and they realized that maybe the desire to surprise the audience but not revealing too much had worked against them. So then you move into magazines, you move into TV, radio, chat shows, and so on. And interestingly, Kevin Costner in particular spent quite a bit of time explaining how hard it had been to make Waterworld and what they were up against and so on, and almost, had that rekindled the respect of saying, this is about ambition, this is about vision, and we now kind of get it more, and that encouraged people to go and see it. But, all magazines, from mainstream kind of lifestyle magazine all the way to movie publication, they had Kevin Costner on the front cover. For my part, I think at the time I was reading Total Film as a magazine. Did you ever kind of follow film magazines at all yourself?
Oh yes. I started buying Empire magazine
right
pretty much as soon as it was originally published, and I do remember buying Total as well. Funnily enough, I don't really follow either of those, their web versions. I don't know why. I've never followed them online. Maybe it was things like Internet Movie Database has just sort of taken that gap. I mean, to me, it's interesting because we've reviewed quite a few films with ensemble casts, haven't we? Where their marketing is focused on each of the individual characters, and the two that come to mind straight away, Death on the Nile, and also the work that we looked at for the TV series of The Rings of Power. Each of the characters had their own posters. Each of the characters had their own, almost like mini TV spots, trailers, whatever it was, or focusing in on the costume, focusing in on their character traits and this, that, and the other. And to me, this would have been so apt for this film. They could have done a focus on Kevin Costner and on Enola and on Jean Triplehorn's character, and of course Dennis Hopper's character with his, with all of his costumes and his mannerisms and that. And I think they did miss a trick there to focus in on the characters, and maybe that would have made the film more about everybody rather than just another vehicle for Kevin Costner.
Yeah, no, I think that's very, very fair. Again, hindsight is wonderful things, and for me, I really understand why they didn't want to reveal. It's a bit like the Mandalorian, keeping Grogu hidden from us and Luke Skywalker return. I totally understand that, and that didn't work for them. That just created a void of information and news that was filled in by essentially rubbish and just actually ill feelings, which I don't think was justified. I mean, to the point where, so they spend an absolute fortune, therefore, on the TV, radio spots and magazines. They went ahead and began the process of introducing Waterworld attraction as an area within the Universal Studios theme park. But why wouldn't you? It's your domain.
Yeah.
They even had research would suggest a partnership with Coca-Cola, where they had a limited edition Waterworld soda cans. So back to your reference to the water earlier, and each can featured images from the movie. So if somebody has now from 1995 one of those, it must be worth an absolute fortune. And so they went on with showcasing the music, doing the making of documentaries. But I would say after the release, and maybe that wasn't quite enough, but they carried on, and the movie got that. And I think for me, it peaked in '98 when the TV network ABC finally aired the nearly 3-hour version. They removed bits and bobs that was about swearing and too much violence, but people could see the 3-hour version, and that renewed interest in the movie. For my part, in 95, 96, I was working in a video rental store. I was just finishing my studies to then become a young marketing officer. And that movie, Waterworld, the VHS cassette for our younger viewers and listeners, was out all of the time. People loved watching it in that home environment. And in fact, its success really was in a home entertainment front.
That's really interesting how this has played out, isn't it? I mean, I think about some of those other films that we mentioned that came out the same year. Heat, golden
Yeah.
eye. You could argue that, yes, this film was a victim of the early internet, and maybe the internet and the way the internet interacts with people and the critics, and the fact that we could now communicate more widely. You'd think that almost like scapegoating might have been evident with other films, but I don't remember there being that sort of negativity surrounding any of those other films. In fact, they all probably benefited from the early days of the internet, whereas this one just seems to have been a victim of it. The other question I was going to ask you now is that, as I say, I don't have the DVD. I never bought the VHS. What was released on Blu-ray? Is it now always been the 3-hour version, or does that
so if you go for the
still stick?
If you go for the distributor Arrow Video, which I think are based in Europe primarily, you have two versions. You have the theatrical version, and you have what they call the Ulysses cut, which is just short of 3 hours. And the 3-hour version is a different experience altogether. We can well imagine 45 minutes extra in character development, in scene setting. You spend longer at the end on the island as well. It makes a lot of more sense. You understand more about Enola as well, her origin, but also the build-up of the relationship, which at the start is completely fractious between the mariner, which I think is also so clever. This is a man with no name, the mariner.
Yes.
And then in the relationship with Helen, played by Jean Tripplehorn, and Enola, and how eventually he's changed. This is his kind of hero's journey for himself as well. It's just described a lot better. There's also, because of the 3 hours, a longer spent in looking at the water and the beauty of sunsets and so on. There's also things going on. So if anyone can get their hands on a copy, it's available. You can buy it online now. You will be a different viewing experience for sure.
So I think I do need to revisit this film, and you've inspired me to revisit this film, Pascal. But I am going to look for the Ulysses cut, I think, and I do think it needs to be enjoyed in 4K if that Ulysses cut is available in 4K. So I'm actually really quite looking forward to seeing this film again, and to reflect upon the fact that maybe the critics were unduly harsh on this, and just the fledgling early days of the internet actually created a scapegoat out of this film for reasons that we probably will never know.
No, absolutely. So thank you very much. It's been enjoyable to research it. I learned so much I didn't know about, but that link to marketing, to this idea of a well-intentioned desire to surprise and awe-inspire audiences that somehow backfired, because you leave, like I said, this void, and people want the news, they want to have something, and sadly they latch on to the negativity. And going back to the budget, which seems to have somehow offended people, like when you spend your own money. 2 years later, of course, we had Titanic.
Yes.
That was even more expensive, and nobody had anything. Well, maybe they did, and maybe I've missed it. But you know what I mean? And so for me, Waterworld was also setting the trend into ambition, summer blockbusters, and let's spend the money that is ours. Why wouldn't we?
Yeah, and of course, Titanic was nearly 3 hours long as well, if I remember right.
That's true, yeah.
There you go. So, Pascal, great choice of film. Thanks for that. Thanks for all the research you've done. And thank you, everybody who watched or listened to episode 95 of Two Geeks and a Marketing Podcast. We've really enjoyed this episode. Some great content spotlights, some great shout-outs, some great news items. I'm just getting a really good vibe about everything we've discussed today. So thanks again, everybody. Please do subscribe to the YouTube channel. Please do let us have your comments. You can talk to us on the YouTube channel. You can talk to us on Twitter. You can leave us a message on SpeakPipe, and just let us know what films you'd like us to review. Let us know what content is inspiring your marketing. So until the next episode, please go out there and make sure that your marketing is done right. I was Roger Edwards, and he was Pascal Fintoni.